Time now for French Connections, our weekly look at the intricacies of life here in France with Florence Villeminot. Flo, today we're going to be looking at the world of cheese. French people are quite attached to their cheese. Specifically, we're speaking Gruyère, and there's been a bit of a stink over it.
Absolutely. It's a fundamental question, really, that we're going to be talking about today. What makes Gruyère Gruyère? It's our word du jour. This mild, smooth, and nutty cheese is a staple in Switzerland, but also here in France. It's a proud product of the Savoie region. It's an easy cheese that you eat pretty much every day. It's in staples like the onion soup or the classic croque monsieur. You've certainly had it if you've been in France. And like many beloved cheeses, in France or in Switzerland, to be called Gruyère, you have to follow some very specific rules, production rules, from what you feed your cows to the shape of these big molds that you put it in. For instance, according to the Swiss guidelines, a Gruyère must be made in the region around Gruyère, which is a Swiss town that's been making the cheese since the 12th century. And here in France, French Gruyère has to have holes in it, holes ranging from the size of a pea to the size of a cherry. Very specific, unlike the Swiss version that doesn't have holes in it.
And staying on that note, once upon a time there was friction between France and Switzerland over the use of the label. Now that was cleared up, but there are quite distinctive trademark labels still in place. But there's also a long-running legal tangle with American producers.
Absolutely, because like bubbly producers in Champagne, French and Swiss Gruyère makers successfully managed to lobby European regulators to protect their exclusive rights, but here in Europe. And they'd been hoping to extend this trademark to the United States as well. And this has been done for other products. For instance, Roquefort cheese has a trademark label in the United States. But in a major blow, a federal judge in the United States actually said that Gruyère can be produced anywhere, thereby siding with U.S. cheesemakers. According to this judge, Gruyère has over time become a generic cheese to shoppers in the United States, and under U.S. law, trademarks cannot be given to generic terms. Now, as you can imagine, this was a very bitter pill to swallow for Gruyère makers, including here in France.
C'est une aberration totale. Nous, on ne peut pas laisser dire que notre Gruyère est générique. Il est tout sauf générique. Il appartient à son territoire, à sa façon ancestrale d'être fabriqué, de la production du lait jusqu'à l'affinage ici dans les caves.
So producers in France and Switzerland are quite reasonably perhaps outraged. What's the reaction, though, from American cheesemakers?
Well, they're thrilled, as you can imagine. Representatives of the American dairy industry have hailed this a landmark victory that really sets a vital precedent, in fact, in a much larger ongoing battle over food names between Europe and the United States. Let's take the case of Wisconsin, for instance, which is the #1 cheese-producing state in the United States, and American producers there have been making a very similar style cheese, but using the name Alpine cheese. And so now they can call their cheese Gruyère. Now, cheesemongers in the United States say getting rid of the exclusive label will ultimately be good for the customer, though they do admit that the production methods are quite different.
We want to have products in different parts of the world that are accessible to everybody, and I think that's an important element of U.S. Cheese production. The European ones will go up higher in the Alps, and you'll get different microbials as you'll go up, where the U.S. ones do more rotational crops or farming, pasturing.
So we've heard from the producers, but what are American customers actually saying about all of this?
Well, it's quite a mixed bag, actually. And let's take a look at some reactions to a blind test between French and American versions of Gruyère, this being in the United States. Take a look.
Yeah, the French one, yeah. Less pungent, I think.
Yeah, definitely.
A little more mellow, yeah.
Probably because I'm Americanized. My taste buds are Americanized.
Now, as for French customers, they're adamant the French version is by far the best. Take a listen.
La Gruyère américain.
Je connais pas.
Attends, ils peuvent toujours essayer d'en faire, mais ils feront jamais aussi bon que nous.
Now, the battle might seem trivial, but it's actually part of a broader struggle, isn't it, Flo, between the US and France?
Absolutely, and it's specifically over trademark labels. Now, when it comes to Gruyère, for instance, the production of French Gruyère is almost exclusively sold in France, so it doesn't really make that big a deal in terms of exports. But exports are a huge deal for the Swiss Gruyère market. In fact, 12% of Swiss Gruyère is sold in the United States, so as you can imagine, protecting the name is a big deal. But there are very different visions of these protected names between Europe and the United States. The United States tends to see these trademark labels as confiscating a name that's ultimately harmful for producers and consumers in the United States. But there's a very different vision here in the EU that sees all this as protecting a culinary heritage from very specific geographical areas that require really craftsmanship that's been handed down for generations. It's all about protecting the reputation of the original product and thereby quality and thereby the consumer as well. For instance, if you take the example of feta cheese, which is produced in Greece, for instance, traditionally made with sheep's milk or goat's milk, it can be really risky to buy it outside of Europe, where it's often just a different product. It's made with cow's milk, for instance. So it's a very different cheese under the same name. So that's why here in France or in Switzerland, Gruyère makers are really adamant about protecting their cheese, because the real deal is much better than the fake Gruyère. Trust me, if you've tasted it, you will definitely agree with me.
Well, I have tasted it, but I must admit I wasn't quite aware that I had tasted it. Thank you so much for all of that, Flo. And for more from Florence and other French Connections episodes, you can check out our website. That's france24.com.